we're looking at the concept of speciation. How did Darwin arrive at some of his ideas on speciation? Well, remember that he went around the world in the ship called the Beagle, and when he came to the area of South America called Ecuador, he noticed that in Ecuador there were a number of different species of finches, and on these islands, the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there were also species of finches, but they were very different to the species of finches found originally in Ecuador. And even on the different islands, depending on what food sources there were and the different kinds of trees there were different kinds of finches. And coupled with the information that he observed about the tortoises, he started to formulate his ideas. Once again, in Ecuador, on the mainland, there were tortoises. On the Galapagos Islands, there were also tortoises, but these tortoises looked different to the original or ancestral tortoise populations. He also noticed that on the islands that had a lot of grass, the tortoises had short necks and a pretty smooth, rounded shell. On some other islands, there was no grass. There were cactuses that stood quite high off the ground. These tortoises that ate the cactuses instead of grass developed longer necks, and the shape of their shell was different. And when these tortoises are put together, they don't recognize each other as mates, as potential mates, and so they no longer interbreed, and therefore they are two different species. And it was these original ideas about the finches and about the tortoises that started Darwin thinking about the ideas of speciation. So speciation then is what we call a lineage splitting event that produces two or more separate species. We know that there's always a common ancestor. We know that there are speciation events, things that happen that cause the splitting of a population, and we know that ancestors give rise to descendants which are completely different from each other. There can be no breeding there, and there can be no backbreeding to the ancestor. How does speciation happen? Well, it could be that a population becomes geographically or ecologically divided, for example, by a river or a mountain range, or separated on an island. And so we have species A that becomes geographically isolated from or a split. Something happens, a mountain range, a volcano, an earthquake splits this population, and the population that finds itself in a different environment has to do something in order to cope and to live. And it could be that some of those organisms have genes for slightly longer necks, and those organisms in the population are going to be the fitter organisms, and they are going to be the ones that survive and produce more offspring. What was this divide? It could be an earthquake. It could be a change in the flow of the river. It could be some tortoises washed away to a nearby island in a bad storm. The important thing is that the two divided populations are isolated from each other, because in order to make a new species, we need to reduce the gene flow between the two populations. If the two populations are still able to breed with each other and in some way become connected with each other, we will not have a speciation event. So this takes place over many years and many different generations. We need geographical isolation, and we need the environmental pressures to be very different. So a tortoise on the one side of the island is very fit for those environmental conditions, but the tortoise on the other side of the island or the other side of the mountain needs to develop different strategies in order to be considered fit in that kind of environment. The isolated tortoises which have genes that favour survival in the new area will survive. They will be the fittest tortoises. And natural selection, as we know, will take place in each population, eventually causing those two populations to become so different that interbreeding becomes impossible. And we say that a new species has been formed, and we call this allopatric speciation. The speciation that occurs when a population is split into two geographically different environments is known as allopatric speciation. And that brings us to the end of our lesson today on speciation. I hope that you'll take time out and work very hard during this week, and I'll see you again next week.